Thank you very much for a very good afternoon to our viewers and participants in the United Kingdom and in the European Union. And of course, good morning to our viewers in the United States. A warm welcome to the online discussion, Defense and Security in Europe, Biden and Brexit as New Parameters. Thank you very much for joining us. This event is jointly organized by the Federal Trust, the Global Policy Institute, and the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung. My name is Matthias Bahner. I'm the director of the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung representation in London. Less than 2 months have passed since the inauguration of President Joe Biden in Washington, and only a few weeks before, the United Kingdom and the European Union opened a new chapter in their relations with the so-called Trade and Cooperation Agreement as a consequence of the Brexit. But what does it mean for the future security and defense in Europe? What are the implications for NATO, our transatlantic security partnership? And what form of security cooperation between the United Kingdom and the European Union can we expect? To discuss this and other important aspects, I'm very pleased to welcome our highly distinguished speakers, starting with Victoria Honeyman, Associate Professor of British Politics at the University of Leeds, Richard Whitman, Professor of Politics and International Relations at the University of Kent, and last but not least, David McAllister, Member of the European Parliament and Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the European Parliament. A very warm welcome also to Brendan Donnelly, the Director of the Federal Trust, who will chair this discussion. Brendan Donnelly has been Director of the Federal Trust since 2003. He was a member of the European Parliament before he was educated at Oxford and worked in the Foreign Office, the European Parliament, and the European Commission. And let me express our gratitude as Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung for cooperating with you, Brendan, and the Federal Trust, not only on this occasion, and focusing on a variety of current political topics. Brendan, many thanks, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to echo very much the pleasures that the Federal Trust feels in its cooperation and collaboration with the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation. This goes back a number of years. We're very pleased to welcome you as a new successor to Felix and to Hans and to Claudia. We're sorry that you arrived at a time when your work has been so difficult to pick up the threads. Let's hope we're coming to the end of the pandemic and it will be possible for us to resume our normal professional and social lives. We're particularly lucky to have Mr. McAllister to speak to us today because we could scarcely have a more expert or knowledgeable speaker. He had a distinguished political career in Germany. He was the Minister-President of Lower Saxony, and then he decided that his future lay in the European Parliament. And he's been a great success in the European Parliament. He's chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Parliament, and he's very active in the EPP, the European People's Party, where he's a vice chair and obviously very influential in setting European policy. I've not got much to add to what is the advertised title. Really what we're asking is, will there be a new equilibrium, particularly as far as defense and foreign policy, defense and security is concerned, in Europe after Brexit and in the presence of a new and perhaps more conciliatory president. But the real question I think that we will want an answer to is not just what will this equilibrium look like, but is it possible to establish an equilibrium after Brexit? In my view, it should not be taken for granted that there is such an equilibrium that can easily or even with difficulty be established. And I'm looking forward, as you all are, to hearing what Mr. McAllister has to say on this subject. I noticed that the picture of Mr. McAllister has blocked out. Can you hear me, David?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, there you are now, yes. Yes.
I can hear you and I can see you.
Very good. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Good evening and kind regards here from Brussels. This is a plenary week of the European Parliament. In the moment, we are always meeting in Brussels and not in Strasbourg for obvious reasons. I would like to thank the organizers, and I welcome this opportunity to participate at, I would say, a very timely moment on the future development of European and British defense and security policy. Now, we all know in times of COVID-19, it appears needless to say that the European Union, as well as the rest of the world, is currently facing historical challenges that may also pose a risk to our security interests. Besides COVID and all the economic repercussions, we are also dealing with the challenges arising from climate change and migration. And we are facing multiple modern security threats such as terrorism, disinformation, and hybrid cyber attacks. All these issues are complex. All these issues are interlinked. And all these issues require a coordinated approach among partner countries. Not a single country on earth will be able to combat these challenges on its own. Now, in the wake of these two challenges, two of the European Union's main partners, the United States and the United Kingdom, are currently undergoing, I would call it, substantive political changes with potentially long-lasting implications, possibly also for our cooperation in the field of defense and security. So the title of tonight's panel debate is Biden and Brexit as New Parameters. Well, I would like to give you my humble perspective from Brussels on these changes and first address the current state of play in security and defense cooperation with the United Kingdom. Brexit has obviously altered the European Union's entire relations with the UK drastically. The conclusion of the trade and cooperation agreement just after 10 months of intense negotiations that ran literally until Christmas Eve is unprecedented in many regards. Indeed, the UK has decided to leave the EU, the single market, and the customs union in a context of regulatory divergence. This means since the 1st of January, two separate legal systems and two separate markets exist, unfortunately. However, the agreement, which has now been already provisionally applied for a little more than 2 months, sets out a unique single institutional framework, including a horizontal dispute settlement mechanism linking together various fields of cooperation. This, from my point of view, does constitute a good foundation for our future partnership, but of course it's up to both sides to make the best of this. While the agreement is indeed very comprehensive, covering a wide array of cooperation topics, it does lack chapters on substantial matters such as financial services or foreign affairs, security, and defense cooperation. This is due to the unwillingness in London to negotiate on these matters, even though, as you may remember, they were originally envisaged in the political declaration accompanying the withdrawal agreement. The European Parliament, and especially the Committee on Foreign Affairs, which I have the honor to chair, very much regret this, but this is the situation we now have to face. Having said that, the agreement does encompass several important provisions in the area of security cooperation. For instance, the agreement entails a separate chapter on cybersecurity that lays out a structured dialogue between the EU and the UK and covers arrangements regarding cybercrime, cybersecurity, and the security of emerging technologies, as well as the cooperation with the EU Agency for Cybersecurity. And secondly, the United Kingdom will maintain working relations with the EU-wide law enforcement agencies, Europol and Eurojust, which provide platforms for sharing information, launching joint investigations, operations, and prosecutions. And thirdly, several political clauses establish the foundation for security cooperation with the UK concerning issues such as counterterrorism, small arms light weapons, weapons of mass destruction, and other serious crimes of concern to the international community. So these clauses further allow dialogue and context and cooperation in the context of multilateral fora. Last, in addition to the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, both sides have concluded another agreement on the exchange and protection of classified information. It is also provisionally applicable since the beginning of this year, and the EU and the UK are currently negotiating the specific implementation arrangements. This agreement applies strong guarantees as how to handle the exchange of classified information, which is a vital tool of cooperation in addressing common security threats. Now, why have I mentioned all this? Because nonetheless, the list of provisions I just mentioned is not exhaustive and of course not comparable to the cooperation frameworks of common foreign and security policy and common security and defense policy, of which the UK used to be a part as a member state. As a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council and as a loyal NATO ally, the UK will of course continue to be an important player in the international arena, and therefore the EU has a huge interest that this country remains our key strategic partner in defense and security. So I will continue advocating that it's in both sides' interest to maintain a close and lasting cooperation in the field of foreign policy, security and defense, particularly for promoting peace, security, a rules-based global order, effective multilateralism, supporting democracy and the rule of law, and also protecting human rights and fundamental freedoms. We have so much in common. In the short run, an agreement was not possible. In the longer run, I still believe both parties should therefore set up a particular structure of security cooperation. The European Union has a number of tools at its disposal to involve third countries in its various defense policies, such as the option of a framework participation agreement. In the short run, I believe we now need a pragmatic approach. We should work together closely and swiftly in an ad hoc manner to address pressing issues that cannot wait. For instance, we need to align our sanctions policies and more broadly cooperate on matters regarding China, Russia, transatlantic relations, and also EU-NATO cooperation. We understand in Brussels, the UK is now seeking to position itself as an independent global player. We respect that. We will therefore have to find new ways and modes of security cooperation on the basis of reciprocal treatment between equal partners. The European Parliament definitely stands ready to play a constructive role. And now my second comment is on the security cooperation with the US. I can be brief here. As more or less all over the world, the European Union welcomed President Biden's pledge for multilateral rules-based international order. This commitment is a vital signal after multilateralism had experienced severe backlashes under the administration of President Trump. Things can only get better. We in the European Union are very positive when it comes to sharing ties, sharing values and common interests, and we are looking for and hoping for a new impetus in transatlantic relations. Security and defense are the bread and butter of the transatlantic alliance. Hybrid threats, cybersecurity, and disinformation are the new threats to transatlantic security. They have been further exposed by the COVID-19 pandemic and have revealed gaps in the response of open democratic states to them. In the last report, the European Parliament adopted as regards the Common Security and Defence Policy Framework, we promised and called to strengthen transatlantic cooperation, but we also called to engage more in common security and defence policy towards a fully fledged European Defence Union. But what is important is, and I will be very passionate here, we believe that it is also in America's interest to have a strong, sovereign, and reliable partner in the 27 EU member states. being strategically autonomous, as our French-speaking colleagues would call it, or being strategically sovereign, as I prefer to call it, is therefore about meeting our specific security interests and needs. This is about reinforcing and not undermining transatlantic security cooperation and NATO. It is about remaining transatlantic, but on the other hand, becoming more European. And I believe that also the United States can only benefit from a stronger European pillar within NATO, the NATO framework. Finally, there are a number of policy fields where I see close cooperation between the European Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States. I can be brief. The first is the nuclear deal with Iran, the conclusion of the Joint Common Plan of Action, the JCPOA in 2015 has been seen as a milestone for multilateralism, as a key player of the global non-proliferation architecture. The EU has been among the promoters of the agreement to establish a political balance, especially between the two sides of the Atlantic. Let's continue to work on this. Second country, China. China is, of course, the technological challenge to the West, but also a strong and more assertive military actor in the Asia-Pacific theater. We all know what's at stake, and we also know when it comes to communications, artificial intelligence, hypersonic weapons, or quantum computing, how strong the Chinese are. But they're also, unfortunately, strong in disinformation campaigns and propaganda, something we have once again witnessed, particularly during these weeks of the pandemic. So I believe the US, the UK, and the EU should work together in creating a global alliance of democracies that has a common answer to the rise of authoritarianism and facilitates cooperation in developing standards and norms to regulate the technologies that enable hybrid threats. And finally, President Biden has had his first policy test with Russia. On the one hand side, he has indicated that the US will seek an extension of the nuclear arms control agreement New START with Russia. I welcome this. But on the other hand, the Biden administration strongly has condemned Mr. Navalny's arrest and the alleged cyber attacks in the US from the Kremlin. The recently imposed sanctions against Russian officials by both Brussels and Washington and London show that cooperation and coordination of foreign policy efforts is very much possible when dealing with Moscow. So, having said all this, we will closely follow the political developments in the US and in the UK, but I strongly believe that even though, unfortunately, the great United Kingdom has left our European Union, we can still work together. And I deliberately do not talk about a relationship we have with the UK. I talk about a partnership, because the UK will never just simply be a third country for us, but a solid NATO ally, a trade partner, and a good neighbor and friend. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very, very thought-inspiring and provoking, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions. If people want to ask questions, there's a Q&A button, which I shall be keeping an eye on. If I may, I'll now ask the first of our two respondents to comment on any aspects that seem particularly provocative or interesting of Ms. McAllister's speech. I'm going to invite Victoria Honeyman, who's an associate professor of British politics at Leeds University, who's particularly interested in British party politics as they impinge upon foreign policy, to make a comment. I think it's particularly appropriate when we look back at Brexit, which is a phenomenon not just of internal party politics in the United Kingdom, but internal conservative politics within the United Kingdom. I'll be very interested to hear what Victoria thinks will be the point of equilibrium, if there is going to be a point of equilibrium between internal political pressures and Britain in its relationships with the EU and the US. Victoria.
Thank you, Brendan. I'd just like to say that I found David's talk very interesting, and I'm going to pick up on several aspects of it. But as Brendan rightly says, my particular interest is less military bombs and bullets and all of those kind of things, and the policies that drive people to get to where they are. And when I was thinking about the talk today, I was thinking about how much Brexit had actually changed foreign policy for the British, and how much had changed economically and politically for the British in their relationship with the EU, and whether that had really been reflected in foreign policy. And I have to say that I think that in terms of foreign policy, there hasn't been, in some ways, an enormous change for the British. If you read the papers, they will tell you that very little has actually changed for the British, although I wouldn't necessarily agree with all of that. But there is a presumption that somehow Brexit in foreign policy terms has brought Britain back to basics. It's brought Britain back into the arms of the US in a way that they felt was slightly muddied, I suppose, by their relationship with the EU. And I think that the EU, despite their best attempts of trying to engage with the British, and have been successful in many ways in doing that, the relationship between the EU and the UK as far as foreign policy is concerned through CFSP has never quite measured up in British political parties to their expectations of the relationship with the US and the UK. There used to be the old idea about prime ministers in the UK either looked over the Atlantic to the United States or they looked over the Channel to the EU. And for many British prime ministers, there really hasn't been any choice in which they've done that. They've always known the way that they wanted to go. So I was trying to think about how that would change in relation to Brexit and how things would be different. And I was trying to think about some of the things that David has mentioned about the move away from formalized setups like CFSP, but remaining obviously a devoted NATO nation. Britain is staunchly in favor of NATO. Obviously, we are permanent members of the Security Council. And it seemed to me that in many ways, it isn't so much Brexit that changes the foreign policy debate in Britain. It is the fact that Britain may be forced, partially because of Brexit, partially because of new realities, and partially because of old realities, to try and adapt our views on foreign policy. David rightly said about the idea of multilateralism, that Britain cannot act alone. No nation has the ability to act alone. And it seems to me that component and the need to realize that and to figure out who you can work most effectively with is really the thing that is going to come into very sharp focus in terms of foreign policy for the British. And it got me thinking about, if we are working with the United States more, and there is a constant discussion in the United Kingdom about our relationship with the United States, and as David McAllister rightly said, that relationship it's not about the niceties of presidents and prime ministers coming together and walking, down the White House steps or whatever it may be. It is about the everyday sharing of military and intelligence operations. It's about that kind of integrated process. What is going to happen now that we are post-Brexit, but also now that we have Biden in the White House? We need to be thinking about some of the things that David mentioned, the issues relating to how are we going to engage with China? How do we engage with India? How do we engage with Brazil? How do we engage with the US? Countries where we perhaps may want to be more strident in foreign policy terms, but actually we are hamstrung by the size of our nation, our military abilities, and also by the fact that we realistically need a trade deal. How strident can you be with the Chinese, for example, over human rights violations? And this is something that's very live in the United Kingdom at the moment, where there is concerns over funding that the Chinese have previously committed to for various nuclear power plants, for example. How do you square that circle when you feel that the Chinese perhaps are breaking human rights norms, but you don't necessarily sit within a big unit like the EU, who may have the ability to be able to pull levers that you can't? And these were the kind of things that I was thinking about. Within certainly the more popular UK press, there was a presumption that Trump was pro-British, that as much as he could be pro-anything that wasn't directly related to him, because he had a Scottish mother, because he had a bust of Winston Churchill in the White House, that he was more pro-British. I've always found that to be a rather odd idea, really, particularly for somebody who campaigned on the idea of making America great again. The idea that America would not come first in that kind of thinking, whether it be in relation to foreign policy, whether it be in relation to trade deals, always seemed to be rather confusing to me. But there's equally been an assumption or a suspicion, I suppose, that Biden is not the typical ally that the United Kingdom might be hoping for, particularly in a democratic president. There's obviously been concerns over his relationship with Johnson when Johnson was a journalist and some of the things that were written, but I tend to think that that's kind of noise. The bigger concern seems to me that the Americans are concerned over Ireland. This is their big worry, not simply because Biden is of Irish descent. I think that is slightly kind of window dressing, but the issue of Ireland obviously looms large, and therefore, while I think that Biden would, under normal circumstances, be considered an ally, I think that the relationship looks a little less warm than perhaps you might have assumed. But as David said, the day-to-day business of that relationship continues, and it will continue. But what does that mean more widely for a post-Brexit Britain in terms of foreign policy, in terms of the United States? It seems that at the moment, we're struggling to get a lot of traction in terms of foreign policy discussion. COVID is sucking out the discussion. It's just occupying everybody's minds to such a massive degree, of course, as Brexit did before that. But we are beginning to see sections of the United Kingdom populace and the newspapers begin to talk about some of these things, like obviously Myanmar, Saudi Arabia, China. There's been a lot of discussion over the last couple of weeks about issues relating to Bahrain and the missing princesses. But no action has really been taken. We've seen lots of encouraging discussion and condemnation on those issues, but no action, because it's very difficult to take action on those things. When you sell huge amounts of goods, services, weapons to countries, you don't necessarily want to upset the apple cart, particularly when you already have an upset apple cart in terms of Brexit. Those things that were perhaps important but not crucial take on a greater significance. So I think that the US obviously has considerably less to lose. So they're offering certain condemnation, but not a great deal else either. So I think it's unlikely that we're going to see the US and the UK storming off to war anytime soon. But it does seem to be that they are returning to basics in the idea of who or which nations are their big concerns. But I don't think we're seeing the unity between Washington and London that London would like. It may come. It may not come. It's difficult to know. But it seems to me that in foreign policy terms, the aims of Britain have changed very little. And I think that they need to recognise, I think our government need to recognise that actually the world is changing around them to a great extent, and that perhaps they may wish to be slightly more cooperative with their EU partners than they had previously perhaps thought that they needed to be. So a rather pessimistic picture, I'm afraid, Brendan, but that would be my interpretation.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I should have mentioned that sadly, thank you for an excellent response. David has to leave us at 6:30 our time. So what I'm going to do is ask Richard to speak perhaps for 10 minutes, as Victoria has. And then we'll give David the opportunity to have any immediate comments on the respondents, and then we'll go to the questions. We'll be able to continue after 6:30, putting questions to Richard and Victoria, who then will become respondents in their own name. But Richard, it's for you now. And Richard is as expert a speaker like the other two as we could possibly have. He's written a great deal on European foreign policy. He's a professor of politics and international relations at the University of Kent. He's also a member of the Council of the Federal Trust, and he's one expert that we'll never tire of. Thank you, Richard.
Well, thank you very much, Brendan. That's very kind of you to say, and thank you to the Federal Trust and vielen Dank to Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung. I found both David and Victoria's remarks absolutely fascinating, and I can see that there's a lot for us to get stuck into in our discussion. What I want to do, if I may, is just to say a little bit about the UK on the defence side, because Victoria's done a fantastic job of talking about foreign policy, and then pick up on David's remarks on strategic autonomy or being strategically sovereign, if I may, and where the UK might fit with that. So I think it's an absolutely fascinating moment to consider the UK and its role in security and defence in Europe, not just because of Brexit, of course, so the discussion here is timely, but also because the UK is on the cusps of publishing its integrated review of security, defence, foreign policy and development, which we'll get next week. And that's been it's been delayed, but also well trailed. That one of the things it will flag up is that the UK is going to focus a little bit more on some other parts of the world, as well as Europe and the Indo-Pacific region has been flagged up in particular. And why it's of importance for us, for the UK, and I would suggest for Europe, including the European Union, is that because it provides a sort of operating system for the software for Britain's foreign security and defence policy. So it's going to guide, what the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, the MOD, and the UK's national security decision-making infrastructure is going to focus on. And to pursue that analogy a bit further, if you think about the idea of global Britain, which is probably operated on a system that you might call DOS, this is going to be a move to Windows. In other words, you're going to get something that's supposed to have a bit more functionality, more detail, and one would anticipate greater coherence. And that's going alongside the also well-trailed increase in the defence budget for the UK for the next 4 years, which is supposed to not just to include the headline defence expenditure, but also focusing on enhancing and transforming the technological basis of security. So defence gaining more in terms of increased military research and development. And a sort of very public and defence diplomacy aspect of all of this is going to be the deployment of the QE2-led carrier strike group into warmer waters in the course of this year. I think probably intended to be indicative of what some have called a persistent military presence for the UK in the Asia-Pacific, or sometimes styled an Indo-Pacific tilt. So we wait to see all of that next week. And we're also waiting on the Biden administration's national security strategy. I mean, it's issued an interim document called National Security Guidance, which the UK doesn't feature in, but nor does the EU. So I don't think either of us should take it too much offence from that. But it's important for the UK because the US tends to make the security weather that the UK adjusts itself to. But if we think about the UK, so where does Europe fit in what the UK wants to do? As both David and Victoria have said, NATO Europe is important for the UK. It's the most comfortable grounds for the UK when it talks about security and defence. And the UK also feels comfortable talking about bilateral relationships in security and defence policy, particularly with France. That it's privileged through the Lancaster House agreements, but with Germany, where bilaterally there's been a move to try and upgrade what's currently a quite modest relationship. And the UK is rather keen on the idea of the E3, which David touched on the Iran diplomacy, UK, France and Germany caucusing on security and defence policy issues. But we do have this hole, as David pointed out, which is on the EU-UK security and defence policy relationship, which is surprising when you think that both the UK and the EU are both seeking greater relevance in the context of a sort of transforming geopolitics and geoeconomics. And I would have thought that the UK, with this, what I've just identified in terms of changes on the security and defence policy front, should have the confidence alongside the capabilities to engage the EU on these questions, which it didn't seek to do in the TCA negotiations, which it had committed to through the political declaration, again, as David flagged up. And I think that the EU's ambition for strategic autonomy, or to be strategically sovereign, it should be a good point of entry for the discussion. If it's not possible to have a detailed agreement on foreign security and defence policy issues between the EU and the UK at this time, and to be honest, I think the UK is going to have its hands full, both implementing its commitments under the withdrawal agreement and the bits of the TCA that have to be filled in. So probably the last thing that either side wants is negotiations on a new substantive agreement. But I think there is a good argument for both sides to engage on the strategic autonomy objective, because for the EU, I think it's an important political objective, and as David said, it's going to condition the way that some European states think about the transatlantic relationship and where Europe fits into that, and particularly in its widest incarnations, where it goes beyond security and defence to encompass questions of economy and technology. But also, I think, because it looks like the Biden administration is going to be much more interested in the EU taking on greater ambitions for defence, which wasn't the case from the Trump administration, which was really much less interested in that sets of developments. And also because if the UK feels that it doesn't want to have a direct conversation with the EU on this issue, it will be impacted by the effects of the EU doing more defence. And to give a couple of examples, the well-developed EU-NATO cooperation and the 74 joint actions that both organisations have agreed, the UK will be a party to, or is a party to, as a member of NATO, and the UK will be impacted by the development of the EU's Pesco projects and developments under the European Defence Fund. So having the conversation, finding connectivity, and finding a way to sort of structure that conversation, I think is absolutely essential for the relationship. I think in one area in Pesco, the US is already leading the way. I mean, it's already indicated that it's interested in the military mobility package within Pesco, and even though the UK hasn't felt that it can participate in Pesco, it may well end up riding on the US coattails on that. And on the EDF issues, the fact that the UK is one of Europe's most significant defence industrial players with a major defence industrial base and defence programme collaborations with individual member states means that it will almost certainly find itself in a position in which it will want to have a role in the EU-funded defence industrial cooperation, which is going to underpin the EU defence strategic or autonomy capability. But from the EU side, I think one of the ways in which you sort of open this conversation or have this conversation is to have quite an open approach to strategic autonomy. Look at the ways in which you could approach and work with the UK as well as other non-EU states, as opposed to a closed arrangement, which might be the exclusive domain or preserve of the EU member states. So I think there's quite a lot that can be worked on there, and I'll be interested in David's views on that. But just by way of some sort of concluding comments, I think we should also approach the relationship with, or be, to draw on Voltaire for this, we shouldn't make the best the enemy of the good. In other words, if we can't have a formal agreement between the EU and the UK in the security and defence policy area at the moment, we can't even identify a timeline for upgrading that relationship. There are other ways in which the UK can work with EU member states, and already does, bilaterally, minilaterally, through the E3, for example, multilaterally through NATO. And I think probably from the EU side, it would be a good thing to perhaps at least publicly suspend skepticism about global Britain, to perhaps be a bit more welcoming of the idea, and to prepare a constructive response to the integrated review, perhaps pointing out ways in which the EU and Europe can contribute to the UK's foreign security and defence policy objectives, even if the UK found it quite difficult to extend a hand in what will also almost certainly be a sort of textual absence of the EU in the integrated review. So thank you, Brendan.
Thank you, Richard. Thanks very much. I'd like now to give David the opportunity to comment, say, for 5 minutes on the things which have been said in response to his speech, and then we'll go to some questions from the audience. There are quite a number of questions already, some of which are similar to points made by Victoria and Richard. But David, perhaps 5 minutes now in response, and then we'll move on to questions.
Yes, first of all, thanks to Victoria and Richard for these excellent responses and for further input. I would like to just make 2 comments on what I've just heard. The first thing is, there's nothing positive about Brexit from my point of view. It's a total lose-lose situation. But one of the very few positive aspects of Brexit is that thanks to the British withdrawal from the European institutions, we have probably made more progress on our common security and defense policy in the last 5 years than in more than 50 years before. That means with Pesco, with the European Defence Fund, with the annual review of our defence activities, with the EU military headquarters now set up, but we give it a different name, a lot of first steps have been made towards a fully fledged European Defence Union. But still, this is a long, long way to go. Now, this is an event also hosted by the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation. So if you invite a Christian Democrat, and he's a German speaking, he's actually a German Christian Democrat, don't be surprised if you don't receive so much enthusiastic reactions towards the term strategic autonomy. I try to avoid this term. I would always prefer to use the term strategic sovereignty, but it doesn't matter what we call this baby, sovereignty or autonomy. We all know what it means. It means that we in Europe have to do more in many political fields to maintain our sovereignty or to regain our sovereignty, but also when it comes to our own security and defense. Just last week, the annual interparliamentary conference with national parliamentarians, members of the European Parliament, took place this time for the second time in a row digitally. And we had Jens Stoltenberg as a guest speaker. And Jens Stoltenberg said, NATO has a huge interest in closer NATO-EU cooperation. And he said NATO has a huge interest in strengthening the European pillar, but of course within the framework of existing NATO structures. And he gave us an interesting figure, which we should always underline here in Brussels. Since Brexit, 4 key members of NATO are not members of the European Union, not only the United States and Canada, Turkey, but also now Britain. And yet Stoltenberg said that 20% of defense spending in NATO is actually being spent in EU member countries. So 80% is being spent outside the European Union. And what we have to understand in Brussels is, and I am very engaged in strengthening the common security and defense policy, we in Europe talk about our own security and defense, but for a long, long time, we simply won't be able to defend ourselves. And since the British have left, it's become even more difficult. So that's why let me underline what our German Defense Secretary and my former party leader, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, mostly abbreviated in your country, AKK, what AKK always says is it's about remaining transatlantic, but becoming more European. Now, the second point is, where does this all fit in the Brexit negotiations? Since I'm the chairman of the UK coordination group, Mr. Brexit, replacing Guy Verhofstadt since February last year, I have spent dozens of meetings with Michel Barnier and Maroš Šefčovič. And I had the impression that perhaps we read the political declaration more carefully, not only on security, defense, and foreign policy, but also on other issues like the level playing field. But anyhow, if you see what was agreed upon in the political declaration and what, from my point of view, generous offer the EU made to the UK as regards future cooperation on foreign affairs, security and defense policy, from participation in activities of the European Defense Agency, over permanent structured cooperation, over management operations, peace building operations, so many issues. We made a broad offer, but as a matter of fact, the UK refused to negotiate anything of this at all. So that's why, indeed, as Richard Whitman said, in the short run, we will have to cooperate on an ad hoc basis, but still I believe that we should work for the midterm future on some kind of particular structures of cooperation. I know that the European External Action Service is in a process of consultation with the member states, but of course, in the end, it needs two to tango. If the British are not interested, we will just simply have to accept this. But I'm often asked, where could these particular forms of cooperation be? And I would always name four. The first I already mentioned, the framework participation agreements. The EU has 18 of these agreements already being signed, including one with the United States. The second point is there should also always be a standing invitation for the British to participate in battle groups. Third countries can participate in those, but cannot take the role of a framework nation and therefore cannot be in the command. The third point is administrative arrangements signed through the European Defense Agency could be interesting for the UK. We have adopted these kind of arrangements already with Norway, with Switzerland, with Serbia and Ukraine. And finally, regarding the involvement of third countries in Pesco, the European Defence Fund, and Galileo. This is governed by legislative provisions adopted and is subject to very strict conditions, but third states can add value to a Pesco project and may be invited to participate if they meet a number of political, substantive, and legal conditions. So the one thing is that I wanted to underline that we must be fully aware that for a long time, we in Europe heavily rely on transatlantic cooperation, including the UK. And when it comes to the nitty-gritty, then few new structures of cooperation, there's still a willingness here in Brussels to reach out. And let me once again thank both Richard Whitman and Victoria Honeyman for their very interesting comments.
Thank you very much. Can I put you some questions which have come from the audience now? One is about ratification of the TCA, of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. Is there any chance, do you think, of the European Parliament blocking or postponing that ratification? I'll put you a number of questions, if I may, so that you can go through them quickly. The CDU obviously is very much associated with the Conservative Party. Do you think that the Conservative Party is interested in the sort of pragmatic relationship in defence and security that you've been talking about? And thirdly, I assume you wouldn't agree with the view of Mr. Macron that NATO is dead. Would you care to say a bit more about the implications of that for Franco-German relations? And perhaps one final point, how realistic is it that the European Union can have a common security policy, a common defence policy, given the importance that national governments are attached to national vetoes in such issues? So those are the questions that I put. Sorry to hurl them all at you, but anything you can say on any of them would be of great interest to the audience.
Okay, as chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee here in the European Parliament, I regularly participate in Foreign Affairs Council meetings in the so-called Gimli format, and I have often witnessed what it means to take unanimous decisions. I think European foreign policy needs to become more effective. And this includes that we have to reconsider how we're operating. I am in favor of introducing qualified majority voting on a number of fields, in a number of fields of foreign policy, as the treaties already allow. For instance, on sanctions or how to handle human rights violations just to name two examples. But the problem is that to introduce qualified majority voting, you need a unanimous decision, and there are some member states who are strictly against this. When we just saw the latest case as regards the sanctions towards the Lukashenko dictatorship in Belarus, we all agreed that we needed to sanction people around President Lukashenko, but we had to postpone the decision for weeks because one member state, in this case Cyprus, was trying to connect the issue of sanctions against Belarus officials with the issues around President Erdogan in Turkey. So that's all very unfortunate, but it's difficult. We will have to wait and see. So we need to become more effective. I also am in favor of the Franco-German proposal to introduce a European Security Council that a number of member states on a rotating basis should quicker and better coordinate instead of having this in an EU 27 format. By the way, a European Security Council could also be a bridge to the UK, because of course we will continue to coordinate our foreign policy actions with one of our most important partners outside the EU. That's the first point. Then NATO is not dead. NATO is not brain dead. I strongly believe in the future of NATO, and all of us who followed the Munich Security Conference, which took place in a digital format this time, were actually quite relieved after we heard President Biden speak, Chancellor Merkel, and by the way, also the UK Prime Minister, and even the French President had some positive things to say about NATO. The relationship between the CDU and the Conservatives, that's a long story.
Could you summarize it?
Well, I'll put it this way. We used to be sister parties. In 2009, the Conservatives left the EPP group in the European Parliament. That was a major step. This was also, looking back, probably the beginning of the end. But anyhow, CDU and Conservatives have many common interests and common policy areas, but our relations were a bit strained because we simply took different views on Brexit. Now that Brexit unfortunately has happened, perhaps CDU and the Conservatives could sit down and work together on a number of policy fields without mentioning the B word. I'm sorry, but in Germany, people are still very emotional when it comes to Brexit.
Not just in Germany, not just in Germany.
Well, at least I don't think in Germany you will find many people, perhaps outside the Alternative für Deutschland, who believe that Brexit is a very clever thing to do. And finally, on the ratification process, the European Parliament still has to give its final consent. Originally, the TCA was to be provisionally applied until the 28th of February. This has now been extended to the 30th of April. Last week, the European Parliament was about to set the timetable for our consent procedure, and this is twofold. The one is the vote on a recommendation for the trade and cooperation agreement, and the other thing is an accompanying resolution where the European Parliament will take stock of this agreement, and we will fairly detailed write down what we believe is good, where we criticize certain things, and what we could imagine could be improved quickly. Now, we were supposed to set the timetable last week, and then came the latest developments on the protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland. And the group leaders unanimously decided to postpone this decision. So we haven't given our consent yet. I would recommend the European Parliament to vote in favor of this agreement, because in the end, despite a lot of critical things, what would be the alternative? The alternative would have been a chaotic British withdrawal from the European Single Market and Customs Union on the 1st of January with all the consequences. So I believe that we will vote in favor. But it's my final point. The withdrawal agreement, including the protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland, are of crucial importance. And for us, the only way to protect the Good Friday Agreement and peace and stability on the island of Ireland, and we call on our British friends and partners to not continue a policy of taking unilateral decisions, especially outside the framework of the withdrawal agreement and the future trade and cooperation agreement. We know exactly how difficult the situation in Northern Ireland is. And many people in Brussels know it's about facilitating easy everyday life in Northern Ireland. But these issues need to be addressed in the joint committee, where we sit down to discuss pragmatic and flexible solutions, how to deal with the protocol. But what we are seeing now is that for the second time, the UK is set to breach international law. And it feels as if we are back to square one, where we were in September, when we were following the British internal debates on the UK internal market bill. So please let us sort these things out. Let's talk with each other and not about each other. And we call on our British friends to reconsider the decisions taken as regards the delay of necessary controls and checks between Britain and Northern Ireland. We know how important the protocol is. And as long as this question has not been answered, I don't believe that the group leaders in the European Parliament will be ready yet to set a date when we will actually vote in favour. So perhaps if you meet David Frost tomorrow somewhere in London, please send him kind regards.
Final question, if I may, because I know you have to go. How do you see relations with China as interacting with the triangle, if you like, of the European Union, United Kingdom, and the United States of America? Even perhaps that's even more difficult to triangle, in that there are differing views within the European Union about the relationship between trade and human rights in China. Can you say something about that, please?
I think we've seen more unity in recent years in the European Union as before. And not only are we seeing more unity in the EU, and Chancellor Merkel and President Macron have always made clear to their fellow leaders and the other member states, the format of the European Union in dealing with China is not 10 plus 1, 11 plus 1, 16 or 17 plus 1. No, it's 27 plus 1. And it was very unfortunate that the EU-China summit, which would have been the first 27 plus 1 format under the German EU presidency, the presidency of the Council last year in Leipzig couldn't take place because of the pandemic. So we're seeing more unity. And also we understand that on many, many issues, we have to develop a joint approach towards a communist regime in China with our friends in the United States and our friends in the United Kingdom. We are in the moment working on a report in the European Parliament, how to deal with China, given all these new circumstances. I would bring it down to a simple sentence: the 3 C's. Cooperate where possible, compete where needed, and confront where necessary. I think that is a very clear statement. We know that, for instance, fighting climate change, China will remain for us an important partner. We want to compete with China, but we need fair competition. The so-called level playing field doesn't only apply for dealing with the UK, it also applies dealing with China. That's why Chancellor Merkel managed to get through the so-called KAI, the investment agreement with China, at least in a first draft during the German presidency. It's about fair competition for our businesses operating on a very challenging Chinese market. But of course, we have to confront China, especially when it comes to Hong Kong, how they treat Taiwan. And finally, for me, the biggest scandal of all Chinese scandals, the outrageous treatment of the Uyghur minority in the west of China. I am rather astonished that this mass violation of human rights isn't criticized more in the international debate. So that's how I would sum it up. Unfortunately, I still have parliamentary session and have to go back to the plenary now. Thanks for inviting me, and hopefully I was able to make clear what we strange people in Brussels are thinking.
very few in your audience think that people in Brussels are strange. There are lots of people in your audience who think we have a rather strange government in the United Kingdom at the moment. So don't be too modest. Thank you very much indeed for such a comprehensive and remarkable tour d'horizon. Particularly, thank you for responding to the questions.
Thank you, Victoria, and thank you, Richard. All the best. Thank you, Brendan, too.
Goodbye. So we lose Mr. McAllister. Richard and Victoria, would you like to comment on things that that he said? And then there are two other questions which I'm going to put to you. Richard, let's start with you.
Thank you, Brendan. It's a shame Mr. McAllister's gone, because I wanted to disagree with him, but I'll send him an email after the session. But I'm not sure whether the EU's offer to the UK on foreign security and defence policy in the political declaration could really be characterised as a generous offer, which is the way that he described it. I think it was a pretty run-of-the-mill offer. I mean, whether the UK was only deserving of a run-of-the-mill offer is, perhaps a matter for some debate. But I don't think it was such a fantastic offering, and I think it was one of the failings really in the negotiations that that I'm sure that if they were rerun, the EU would want to address, and the areas where he suggested that the UK could easily sort of slot in a framework participation agreement, participation in battle groups, admin arrangements for the European Defence Agency and Pesco and so on, again, are all pretty standard offers. And it's probably also worth mentioning, because Mr. McAllister mentioned Galileo, is that really for those in London, certainly in Whitehall, who wanted to press for a bit more ambition on security and defence policy relationship, the experience over Galileo and as they read it, the sort of locking out of the UK was one of the things that led to a certain disenchantment and a certain sort of squashing of voices who were arguing for more security and defence policy or more ambition in that area, which is what Mrs. May did have originally or set out originally. But one other reaction, or one other comment reaction, if I may, which is the point about sort of strategic autonomy and sovereign autonomy and so on. There are, as was suggested by Mr. McAllister, there are disagreements over what this might mean, what the ambition might be, and so on. And I think the Biden presidency and the arrival of the Biden presidency has led to a little bit of rowing back, certainly in Germany, on what the ambitions might be for strategic autonomy in the defence area for the EU. But some of his other points, I'll save for answers to other questions, if I may, and let Victoria come in.
Okay, Victoria.
I'm frantically writing notes as Richard's talking. There was an awful lot in what both Richard and David said, and therefore my thoughts on it are disjointed because there's all sorts of different things. I thought that David made an excellent point, which perhaps if I'd been braver, I would have made myself, which was that the UK and their attitude towards CFSP was frankly to maintain the policy at a level where it didn't interfere too much with NATO. It was to maintain it at a level where they felt comfortable with it. And I think really that is perhaps at the heart of some of the differences between the EU and the UK. And I think it came out in what David was saying, which Richard responded to. If you are in Brussels, you have a very specific view of the EU, what the EU does, how it relates to other nations. And therefore, if you are in the EU, if you're in Brussels, you may well think it is a generous offer for the United Kingdom. If you are in Westminster and you are existing in the Westminster bubble, you have a very different view of what the world looks like, but also about the things that you expect and the things that you are happy to live with. I noticed that David mentioned about the idea of Britain keying into certain potential military action in the future. And I agree that the idea of bilateral or even multilateral action is certainly possible. We've done it before, we may well do it again. But I think that when it comes to those kind of actions, Britain sees itself. And by that, I mean the politicians who are kind of driving through the rhetoric on this debate see themselves as being leaders, not followers. And therefore, that feeds into how they respond to CFSP. It feeds into how they think about NATO. And the idea of structured frameworks of decision-making, I think the British will only agree to those aspects that they find to be specifically in their own best interest to do so. Now, that's all well and good if you can get both sides to agree what's in the best interest of everybody involved, and I'm not sure that that necessarily works. So I think that we will probably see any agreement with the EU being, in terms of defence and foreign policy, and possibly intelligence, as being considerably more threadbare than perhaps we might have wanted, and you'll see more kind of episodic agreement on things. As things come up, there'll be more discussion about it. I'm not entirely convinced, I was noticing one of the questions, I'm not entirely convinced that the British want to use NATO and turn it into a particularly authoritarian organisation where the British drive policy through NATO necessarily, because I don't entirely think that that's how the British view NATO. I think they're very happy to drive the kind of areas of discussion, and they're very happy to lead in it. But I'm not necessarily convinced that they would want to have a more administratively cohesive agreement, because one of the things the British like about NATO is the fact that it gives them a certain degree of flexibility in the way that they engage with foreign policy and the way that they engage with military action. So my thoughts are slightly scattered because there was an awful lot, but I think I got everything out.
Good. Well, thank you very much indeed. Can we have one more round of questions that people have put? Somebody asked about Scottish independence, whether we think that Scottish independence, if it happens, or perhaps if it doesn't happen, will affect the strategic and security policies of the United Kingdom. Somebody asked about Atlanticism, that certainly it was David's assumption, and I think probably the assumption of the two respondents as well, that Atlanticism is a thing, that it had a bit of eclipse under Trump, and now it's going to come back under Biden. Is that the right way to look at things? Isn't perhaps the anomaly, which David also pointed to, of Europe being so dependent for its defence upon the United States, isn't that possibly something, an idea whose time has passed? Is any American government in 10 years really going to be as interested in NATO as governments were 20 years ago? And the final question that people asked was about Gibraltar. What do we think is going to happen to Gibraltar, and does it have a strategic and security significance for the United Kingdom? Victoria, would you mind taking some of those?
I will try my best. It is hard to imagine that the United States will, it's not hard to imagine. I can't see the United States pulling out of NATO, but I can certainly see them applying increasing pressure to European partners in order to pick up not only their part of the bill, but also to pick up the bits and pieces that they think that they should be participating in. This is something that Trump obviously talked about, but it was something that Obama had talked about before that. But I don't think that they'll pull out of NATO. I don't see that as being a realistic policy area, simply because NATO it now includes so many countries that butt up against Russia that would be the kind of first line of defense, I suppose, if you see the world in those terms. I do think that Atlanticism as an idea is sort of coming back into favor, but I maybe it's been, I don't know, rebooted for the Biden years. I think there is an interesting debate going on about the kind of Anglosphere, the idea of Britain kind of cooperating more with what used to be, the former English-speaking white colonies, so the United States, Canada, those kind of nations. So I don't think that the Americans will drop NATO, but I think that they will apply more pressure to get a more, not an even split, but to lessen their own burden in that regard. Gibraltar, oh Goodness me, where to begin with Gibraltar? You could see the issue of Gibraltar coming a mile away with Brexit, and I'm not sure what the answer is, because at the moment, the people of Gibraltar are both committed to being British and also committed to being European Union members, because they obviously voted to remain in the referendum. It's obviously a considerable sore spot. I think that the people of Gibraltar will want to see what happens in terms of Brexit, but I think the British would be, I think they'd have to have Gibraltar ripped from their hands very, very unwillingly. So I think that that will be a real hot spot in terms of the coastline, in terms of relations over the border. I don't anticipate any action quickly, but we'll have to kind of watch and wait, I suppose, on that one. Scotland and security. I don't think it would be the top of anybody's kind of problem list if Scotland went independent, because there's so many other things that would be hugely damaging for the Union. Would the British be concerned about it in security terms? Well, certainly there would be implications in terms of nuclear weapon storage and various submarine bases and all of those kind of practical considerations. But I suppose it's problem 50 on a list of, 90 million. So I think it would be a problem, but not necessarily the most pressing problem in terms of Scotland going independent for either the Scottish or for the English.
Thank you very much. Richard.
Thank you, Brennan, and all great but difficult to answer questions. So clearly a talented audience out there this evening. On Gibraltar, Gibraltar, I think, is fascinating, as a British overseas territory, but one which looks to have the most altered relationship with its neighbour than any other part of the UK or British overseas territory, because the agreement that the UK and Spain have reached, I think, was described by Politico as the biggest development in Anglo-Spanish relations on Gibraltar since 1713, which is clearly going some. But the implication being, of course, that if you ease travel between Gibraltar and the Spanish mainland, it means that the Frontex EU border agency is going to be involved in policing that border. So it's going to be a UK border that's going to be policed, or a British overseas territory border that's going to be policed by the EU. So there's some irony in there that I'll leave others to reflect upon. I'll sidestep Scottish independence because I want to say a bit more about the alliance, if I may. Maybe I could come back to Scotland in another answer, because I think the interesting questions about the alliance which stand behind that question from the audience is how relevant is NATO today and tomorrow? So does it remain relevant? And clearly we've just come off the back of a US administration that was begging the question about that. And I think behind the question that we've just had from the audience is whether it remains relevant for forever and a day. And I think you'll be a brave person who would suggest that would be the case. There's interesting questions, though, about leadership for the alliance, because clearly under Mr. Trump, there were real worries about whether the US could continue to provide the same kind of leadership in the alliance that it had in the past. And that's one of the reasons why, we got the moves within the European Union to talk about strategic autonomy and so on, because it was a bit of a hedging strategy to think the unthinkable, which is what happens if Europeans have to think about a transatlantic alliance that the US doesn't want to lead anymore. But for me, the really pressing question, and this is one which is raised by Brexit, is what I call the balance within the alliance. And David McAllister touched on this, that if you go down the road of the European Union wanting to do more on the defence side, and it's that's going to be a long and winding road if it does more, then clearly there are issues around whether the EU member states can be the European pillar of the alliance, and where the non-EU European members of the alliance fit in, including the UK. And the UK will have a strong interest in making sure that those European non-EU member states continue to have a full say in the way that the alliance evolves and the way that the EU and NATO fit together. So I think there are a whole series of issues around NATO and how NATO is going to operate in the future that Mr. Trump sort of shook things up, but now are really sort of out in the open and going to require a bit more thinking for the future.
I'm so sorry, Brendan. Can I just throw in an extra thing that I was thinking about when Richard was talking, which is about nuclear weapons, because this is something which obviously applies to Britain specifically as a nuclear power state, but obviously we are very much in league with the Americans in terms of our nuclear policy and where we purchase our nuclear weapons from. As Richard mentioned earlier, the documentation, the guidelines that have come out from the Biden administration didn't mention the United Kingdom or the EU. They also didn't mention nuclear weapons, and there is an expectation, or perhaps expectations a bit strong, there is a hope in London that the Americans will continue funding for their nuclear weapons research and redeployment, which will then impact on the British purchasing of those nuclear weapons. If the American administration decide that they have other concerns, other things that they wish to spend money on, then it may well be that the issue of nuclear weapons becomes slightly muddier. So that may be one of those issues where the British are looking for allies across the Atlantic. They're looking to their friends to contribute and to help them in this new Atlantic setup. Whether or not it will happen is an interesting one, and we're led to believe that London are pushing hard for that. So I just thought I'd mention it.
Thanks very much. Interest expressed by the audience in defence procurement, whether there will be any scope for defence procurement cooperation between the United Kingdom and the European Union, and also the tactful phrase of David McAllister about the EU perhaps having read more carefully the political declaration than the British did when they signed it. What is the hope based on that record of less than full implementation of what one side thought had been agreed to, for the plausibility of a pragmatic approach by this particular government to the question of defence and security? Leave aside the question of what precisely constitutes pragmatism. What reason is there to believe that this government will be any more pragmatic about defence and security than it has been about other aspects of the Brexit negotiations and the future relationship with the European Union? Richard, can you answer that?
Thank you, Brendan. Again, a great question. I mean, I think that to connect the two questions together, I think that the defence industry area is the area in which the UK would want to be the most pragmatic if you were looking for the sort of candidate for pragmaticness, because the UK is already working with other EU member states and has privileged partners, for example, on the next generation of aircraft and so on. So it's working very closely with Sweden and Italy. It works very, very closely with France on the nuclear question, not through the Lancaster House agreements and so on. So I think defence industry is where you could see things going on in the background. I think the sort of headline news stuff, signing some sort of higher level agreement is much less likely to happen. And I think for the UK, most comfort will come through anything that's done through the the UK NATO EU route. In other words, the wiring could be quite important for the UK. It'd rather sort of go around the houses, I think, than go directly EU UK. But I think there are some, for me, the really telling issue is going to be how the Biden administration responds to all of this, because as Victoria's already indicated, I mean, the Biden administration's security and defense policy is a work in progress. there are lots of really interesting questions and possibilities that it may pursue. And as we know from the past, I mean, essentially British security and defence policy always tacks to fit with what the US is interested in, has to, because of the close security and defence policy relationships. But I think we're going to see some very interesting questions around reciprocation. You know, will the UK suggest to the US that maybe it should be a little bit cold on EU defence policy, or stand up for the rights of European states which are not EU member states as that policy evolves or not? And to, you know, to tackle Scottish independence, if I may, you know, the extent to which the Biden administration will be interested in the Scottish independence debate for the reason that Victoria touched on earlier, which is the nuclear question and the agreements that the UK has with the US on basing and its submarine access to the facilities in Scotland. And that gives the US a real interest in what happens in terms of an independent Scotland's security and defence policy, particularly because the SNP is in favour of getting rid of nuclear weapons in Scotland, and is flip-flopped on NATO membership, and whether Scotland would be a NATO member. So I think that would be one to watch for me as the Biden administration gets its feet under the table.
Victoria.
Yes, I agreed with all of that. I think it is. I entirely agree with the idea about when Richard was talking about the idea of the UK, NATO, EU going around the houses. I think that Britain is, as a governing class, I suppose, relatively comfortable with bilateral defence procurement. We do it with lots of different, well, not lots of, but we do it with other countries on things that we think are particularly beneficial for them and for us. I think doing it directly with the EU is more problematic. It was very interesting when David was talking, and he was talking about the agreement over a timetable for sanctions to Belarus, and the idea that the Cypriot authorities, the Cypriot representatives, had tried to link that to Erdogan and Turkey. And obviously we know that the situation with Cyprus and Turkey is incredibly difficult. And I think that the British are quite comfortable engaging in those kind of games themselves, but incredibly uncomfortable watching other people do it. And I think that they think that there is a certain, I think that there is a lack of tolerance when it comes to the EU that they don't have with with nations like the United States for a whole myriad of reasons. But I think that they would be more comfortable engaging in procurement either in these kind of bilateral or kind of minilateral, I'm stealing that term, I'm afraid, Richard, minilateral kind of organizational setups, or through NATO. But I think that Brexit has been so poisonous, and I think that the underlying tensions that it has exposed have been so damaging that the British will not engage with the EU in happy harmony. They will engage with them, they will do the things that are necessary, but I don't see it as being a particularly harmonious relationship just yet. It might get to that, but I don't think it's there just yet. And I think that would apply to things like procurement. British will only do it if they feel that it is in their best interest to do so. And I'm not convinced that they see it in those terms yet.
Well, thank you very much. Any other points that you or Richard wants to make, and then I'll wrap it up. Richard.
Thank you. I was looking through the Q&A in the chat. I mean, there are some really fantastic questions here. One or two I might nab as examination questions for the summer. I hope there are no University of Kent students viewing this. Otherwise, the questions might be familiar. But I think that there are a number of questions that come up that around Germany and sort of UK-German relations, but also Germany's position within sort of future European security and defence policy, and maybe this is the most, or Germany is the most important determinant, I think, as to whether EU security and defence policy becomes a sort of credible and or plausible proposition. Firstly, because Germany has obviously been a staunch transatlanticist, but both public and elite opinion in Germany has undergone a bit of a shift during the Trump administration. I think secondly, because there has been a real engagement on security and defense policy issues, the fact that it's not just been French politicians and French ministers that have articulated the idea of strategic autonomy, also German ministers, but also because, if we're looking for financial heft, where you could make a difference in terms of realizing greater spending on European defense in a meaningful way, then Germany clearly is a key player and would be a key payer, which is why Germany is interesting. But I think also the British-German relationship is one where there are all sorts of questions as to where it might go. I mean, the UK would love nothing more than to have a well-developed, extensive E3 relationship. Britain, France, and Germany constantly interacting, cooperating, and reaching a collective view on all sorts of security and defense policy issues. And they do a lot of that with the US anyway. They are significant for the way that NATO works. But I think UK would be quite keen to see that extended. France is willing, I think it's probably fair to say, because France has other interest in keeping the UK tied in. Germany is much more ambivalent, and up to this point in time has been really put things, I think, fairly conditionally, that the UK-Germany security and defense policy relationship really will only work if there's a well-developed EU-UK security and defense policy relationship. So if Germany holds that line, then that may be, an important factor in the extent to which the UK gradually comes round to the idea that there should be more of an EU-UK interface in security and defense. If Germany takes a different view, and obviously we're about to go through major leadership change in Germany, then you may find that security and defense, European security and defense questions take a different direction. And we heard the idea of a European Security Council raised by Mr. McAllister earlier. And that's probably a topic for another Federal Trust event, I suspect, Brendan, rather than exploring that particular nook and cranny of European security and defense issues.
Thanks very much. Victoria, anything more? Last word?
Just quickly, yes, there was a question regarding kind of crossover of policy between the EU and the UK and the idea of cooperation. I think that there's an awful lot of concerns and worries and global issues which the EU and Britain in general terms would have agreement over. They would have concerns over human rights violations in parts of the world, issues of the rights of democracy in places like Myanmar. There would be issues perhaps relating to development, which is obviously a huge foreign policy area, concerns over cybersecurity, all sorts of different things. But I think that having those agreements in generality and being concerned about those things doesn't necessarily mean that you mesh well on how you want to fight those things or how you want to deal with those things. And I think that if you look at the way that the British foreign policy is set up, but particularly in terms of their intelligence, in terms of their defense arrangements, the United States is not treated as another nation. It's treated as being the closest nation. It is integrated at all sorts of different levels within military and intelligence organizations in Britain and vice versa within the United States. If you look at something like Five Eyes, there are different levels of sharing with different nations, even though they're all within that organization. The British and the Americans share bilaterally outside of that agreement. So I do agree that there are areas of cooperation and considerable crossover in policy, but I don't necessarily think that that means that you end up with harmonious policy making that works very effectively. And I think that the British feel, whether they're right or not is another question, but I think that they feel that they have more in common with the United States in terms of those policy areas, but also in how they can deal with them than they do with the EU former partners.
Well, thank you very much. I'll be writing, obviously, to David McAllister, thanking him for giving us such a a marvelous presentation. But I think a special word of thanks goes to our two respondents who've given us more than good value. And thanks very much indeed. And I'm sure everyone will be applauding. It's very nice to know that the Federal Trust has a worth beyond its purely academic or political one in providing questions for Richard Whitman to puzzle his students with. Reminds me of the remark of Keynes that every year they had the same questions in the economics exams at Cambridge University. The trouble was the answers were different every year. And perhaps the answers will be different by the time the examinations are put, and then they may be different again next year. I agree with Richard and Victoria that we had some absolutely splendid questions, and I'm only lost in admiration of the fact that nobody had the nerve to, or nobody had the impoliteness to ask David McAllister whether he was a Celtic or a Rangers supporter. We probably have got as ambiguous an answer on that as any politician can give. But thank you very much indeed. I'm going to close the meeting there and look forward to seeing you again in the not too distant future. Thank you very much, and thank you to everyone who joined.